As a Cold War rages on between great powers in the Middle East, Libya has largely been forgotten by the public. Most remember the ousting of dictator Muammar Qaddaffi in 2011, and even more remember the Western involvement within the government overthrow. What began as a humanitarian intervention and the protection of civilian populations in the Benghazi region merged into a multi-state NATO and UN intervention that involved large-scale bombing campaigns and regime change. What many have overlooked, however, is that the Libyan Civil War never truly ended. Old tensions were revived after the 2014 UN-backed national election, leading to a second wave of violence and war, and to what many consider to be a failed state. Welcome to Realpolitik, a podcast where we gather to respond to pressing issues in global affairs by prescribing realistic foreign policy solutions for the governments of Canada and the United States. In this episode, we will tackle the Second Civil War in Libya and propose a way for Canada and the United States to help mitigate the damage dealt to civilian populations within that war and to help organize a peaceful and diplomatic end to it. Differently from our first episode, this will be accomplished through 4 rather than 3 equally long segments. In the first, we will provide context to the war going back to the First Civil War and Revolution. Then, we will respond to counterarguments to foreign intervention in general and to foreign intervention in Libya in particular. After, a case for intervention in Libya will be put forth, based on specific and rigid given criteria. Finally, the details of our policy prescriptions will be outlined, describing in exact terms how the intervention may be carried out and what results and consequences this will spark. This episode may act as a policy brief to guide Canadian and United States foreign policy regarding foreign intervention strategies and criteria. Before getting into counterarguments, we must provide much-needed context to the Second Libyan Civil War. Going back to 2011, the success of the first wave of intervention in Libya is relative to the person you interact with. Many, including US President Barack Obama, who was the main actor behind US involvement in the conflict, would consider it to be an abject failure. Others, such as French philosopher, writer, and advocate Bernard-Henri Lévy, who personally convinced French President Nicolas Sarkozy to lead the French armed forces into the conflict, view it as a success story of humanitarian intervention that saved thousands of lives and established the first functional democracy in the Maghreb after the Arab Spring. Regardless of your affinity with these two arguments, a second wave of civil war has been sparked as a result of the unaddressed tensions and systemic problems experienced by the Libyan government and its society and created partly by such a first intervention. Due to the human rights abuses and civil repression wrought by Gaddafi's dictatorship, and due to a plea from the Libyan people for foreign countries, particularly the West, to get involved, Allied and NATO forces decided to intervene. The first intervention resulted in the toppling of the Qaddaffi regime, something that was not the strategy going into Libya at the beginning. In fact, as stated in the UN Security Council resolution authorizing force in Libya, the goal of the intervention was, quote, to protect civilians in civilian-populated areas under threat of attack. As Allied and NATO airstrikes paved the way to victory for the rebel forces, the regime crumbled, resulting in Gaddafi's capture and murder by rebels. In the immediate aftermath, Libya was declared a free country by NATO and the UN and was to hold national elections in 2012. A new form of government was to be established. Until such an election, although terrorist and militia activity was sustained, relative national peace was established. Moreover, Libya was now free of Gaddafi's ruthless reign and was thus freer than it would have been without foreign intervention. Between the end of the war and the election, Libya was governed by the National Transitional Council of Libya, established by Libyan rebels and politicians who had defected from or opposed Gaddafi's regime. As a result of the UN-supervised election, the General National Congress was born, hosting 6 major democratic political parties and factions. More important, however, was the 2014 parliamentary election, which led to the creation of the Libyan House of Representatives and to the start of the Second Civil War. In fact, according to Christopher Chivas, senior foreign policy analyst at the US government and former researcher at the RAND Corporation, although the elections, supervised by the UN and NGOs, were deemed fair and free, the results were unsatisfactory due to the absence of highly organized political factions and parties in Libya after the revolution. Turnout was quite low at 18% as a result. Moreover, divisions were still very high, with most politicians seen as corrupt, indecisive, and unable to address the sorrows and dread facing Libyans. This was exacerbated by the creation of the Government of National Accord, or GNA for short, which was unelected and created internally by the UN and Libyan government officials. This led to a split between the UN-backed GNA and the House of Representatives, although both parties were quite unpopular amongst the Libyan people. The House of Representatives was also associated with the Libyan National Army, led by General Khalifa Haftar. This signified the beginning of the Second Civil War, as Haftar forces began carrying out attacks on GNA positions through Operation Dignity. This brings us to the current situation. The GNA controls the northwestern corner of the country, having power over the capital region of Tripoli, which holds important air bases, tanker terminals, and oil refineries. Its public allies are Turkey, the United Nations, and the Tuareg and Tubu militias in the south. The United States is also suspected to support the GNA according to internal documents, although that's unclear. The Libyan National Army, also referred to as the Haftar Forces or the House of Representatives, is based in Tobruk and controls most of central and eastern Libya. Its public allies are Russia, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Al-Zintan militias, and militias in the northeast and northwest. France, Italy, Great Britain, and, funny enough, the United States have also been accused of supporting Haftar's forces. The rest of the territory, mostly in the south border regions, is split between indigenous militias and Islamist terrorist factions. Terrorist factions involved include ISIL, Al-Qaeda, Ansar Sharia, and the Benghazi Defense Brigades. The militia's allegiances, however, are subject to change, as they switch camps depending on who is seen as holding regional power and momentum. The proxy fighting has been strongest between Russian and Turkish drone campaigns, which have gone on since late 2019, according to most accounts. Turkish drones have been providing Haftar's forces a tremendous advantage due to their superior range and strength. As a result of this, Haftar has been gaining momentum and has taken control of most of the country's territory, as well as most of the country's air bases, tanker terminals, and oil refineries. The biggest areas of contention have been around Tripoli and its airport, controlled by the GNA, as well as Misrata, now also under GNA control, on top of Sirta, Al-Watiya Air Base, Al-Bari, Al-Zintan, and Zarhuna, the former rear base of the LNA, now under GNA control. This advantage has not come without a price, however, as most of the conflict's allegations of war crimes are directed at Haftar, due to the recent findings around mass graves in the Chadian war under the Qaddaffi regime, which he was an instrumental part of. Nonetheless, the GNA has been pushing Haftar back eastward and gaining more territory in the south by local forces' territory, also continuing to control the capital Tripoli region. It is projected that the conflict will be pushed eastward and southward around Al-Bari and Sabha due to the GNA's recent gains in momentum. As a result of the fighting, around 9,000 people have died, 500,000 have been displaced, and tens of thousands have been injured. After detailing the context behind the war, we will now respond to counter-arguments to the concept of foreign intervention, particularly in Libya. Firstly, many have argued that intervention is simply a new and more subtle tool used by Western great powers to pursue neo-colonialist policies and to take resources and export their societal values. Those behind this argument may point to Iraq as an example, where US and British government officials found wealth and power giving no-bid contracts to various private military contractors, defense contractors, and oil and gas companies like Lockheed Martin, Blackwater, and Halliburton. They will also reference cases where the West did not intervene in cases of widespread human rights abuses, atrocities, repression, and genocide to make their case. Examples of this include Rwanda, Israel, or even China. Proponents of this argument would say that this is due to the lack of security and financial interests in such countries, to the proximity between the countries and the West, especially in the case of Israel, or because they cannot target countries against which they would lose, as is the case for China. Critics may also make the legal argument that countries or international bodies have no legal authority, sovereignty, or precedent to intervene in a sovereign country's affairs. What a government does to its people is their business and their business alone, and we must let the local populations resolve such matters internally. Finally, they may say that intervention is hypocritical in nature, as the West would never let developing or global South countries intervene in Western countries like the United States, where human rights abuses, war crimes, political repression, and genocide have occurred. Another counter-argument presented against foreign intervention is that intervention often or always has unintended consequences, leading to endless wars and occupation. This is an argument that was waged against support of the first Libyan intervention, for instance, as the NATO and Allied intervention toppled a long-reigning government and failed to address the ailments experienced by Libyan society then and since. The only reason we are talking about a second intervention in Libya is because the first one failed. Although the ends pursued might have been moral in nature, in practice, the intervention led to national and regional instability and actually worsened living and political conditions for Libyans, even leading to the resurgence of slavery in Libya. These are all valid critiques of intervention, and they need to be addressed. These may be remedied, or at the very least curtailed, by our policy prescriptions through setting fair and wide-ranging criteria for intervention. Such criteria will be to intervene based on 5 strict criteria, which all have to be met. These criteria will prevent running into the problems that these counterarguments warn against. As alluded to prior, there are 5 criteria for intervention, which all must be met. The first 3 are based upon analysis and research from Barak Siner, a former senior fellow and Middle East director at the Royal United Services Institute. The remainder are based upon our own analysis of case studies from previous interventions, where the satisfaction of such criteria have increased their likelihood of success. They are as follows. Number 1. The country has to have the capabilities and resources to intervene. This means that the funds and equipment required for the intervention should be laid out in detail and approved by the country's legislative and executive branches and appropriate international governmental organizations such as the UN and NATO. Number 2. The country has to pursue long-term strategies and ideals. This signifies that a long-term strategy has to be established, where the country or countries in question would continue to directly or indirectly monitor the intervention's status until its goals are fully carried out. Examples could include establishing a democratically elected government recognized by the United Nations, Freedom House, and Transparency International, or reducing national terrorist activity to 10% or lower of its initial levels as of the start of the intervention. The term victory should also be defined prior to going into the intervention. Number 3. The country has to have specific security and financial interests in the country and region. This could include interest in establishing new regional diplomatic partners and allies, gaining a strategic position in a fight against the superpower foe, or securing new trade deals with the region's countries. Number 4. The country has to be responding to extensive human rights abuses, risk for genocide, or at least heavy and indiscriminate civilian casualties. This can be based on the number of deaths or potential deaths, which should exceed 1,000 at the time of intervention. And finally, number 5, the country has to have the support from local actors, international law, and at least 2 of its allies. This is as unilateral intervention has a much lower success rate than multilateral intervention, especially when it is backed by both local actors and international law. Moreover, if the intervention does not get support from local actors, especially a specific group like an ethnic or religious minority, such as the Kurds in Syria or Christians in Turkey, then the country's sovereignty would be violated. If and only if these 5 criteria are met, should a country intervene in Libya or elsewhere. There is not only a responsibility to protect in Libya, but also a right to interfere. This is as NATO and Allied forces failed in their first mission, which was, as stated earlier, to protect civilians in civilian-populated areas under threat of attack. After about 6 months, a toppled government and a tired but hopeful Libyan people, NATO and Allied forces simply decided to leave. As a power vacuum was left in the country, it was filled by corrupt, unpopular, and power-hungry politicians and military men. The Second Civil War has undone almost all of the progress made by the first intervention and brought with it more problems. Thus, as argued by Brookings Institution fellow Shadi Hamid, NATO and Allied forces must not only resolve the issues they created, but also addressed the issues they wanted to fix while intervening in the first place. Although wars are by definition brutal and cruel towards warring factions and combatants, they should not be towards the civilians caught in the middle of the chaos and destruction. Past interventions, even failed ones, may teach us a lot about the mission of a successful intervention, one which protects civilians rather than harms them. In the first intervention in Libya, it is estimated that thousands of civilian lives were saved, while less than 100 were lost. The goal, nonetheless, should be 0 civilian lives lost. For examples of high return for low risk, we can look to Operation Provide Comfort in northern Iraq, which protected Kurdish populations, the Unified Task Force mission in Somalia that guaranteed the safe delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians, Operation Serval in Mali, where local civilian populations were protected from politicide and totalitarian theocratic rule, and Operation Uphold Democracy, where the Haitian military regime was overthrown to secure the transition of power to the democratically elected president. In all these cases, civilian populations were protected from politically motivated atrocities or even genocide, and the intervention prevented mass suffering and casualties. We must look to these examples for correct and successful cases of foreign intervention. Finally, the cost of inaction and non-intervention often trumps that of intervention. The simple mention of Rwanda still provokes shame for many international relations scholars and policymakers, as the international community stood idly by while 800,000 Tutsis were killed and between 250,000 and 500,000 Tutsi women were raped by ethnic Hutus in a genocide that lasted 4 months. Moreover, many have regretted the NATO and Allied strategy in Ukraine and Crimea, where we have once again stood idly by while Russia trampled the local population's rights and sovereignty. More recent assaults on sovereignty and freedom undertaken by the Chinese government in Hong Kong, Taiwan, the South China Sea, and through its transnational development and expansionist efforts have also resulted in critical debates regarding Western intervention. And even then, what about the Armenians, the Cambodians, the Bengalis? What would have been of Europe and the world had we not intervened in World War II? We cannot stand idly by as massacres and atrocities of the sort occur under our watch. Presented with these arguments, it is clear that moral, legal, and successful intervention is possible, especially in regards to Libya, as it fulfills the 5 criteria given above. We now need to lay out the specifics of a possible second intervention in Libya. Firstly, should both Canada and the United States get involved? Based on the 5 criteria outlined prior, yes, they both should. In terms of capabilities and resources, it is clear that both Canada and the United States possess the power to engage in Libya as they did prior. Since 2011, the US defense budget has increased by $26 billion. The United States military's arsenal and troop levels have also grown significantly during that time. As for Canada, the Department of National Defense budget is at the same level as it was in 2011 at the time of the first insurgency, valued at $21.5 billion. As Canadian overseas troop levels have been steadily decreasing since 2011, the military's resources are thus at either equal or greater capacity than in 2011. In terms of long-term strategies and ideals, this is less clear, as a plan for intervention has not yet been laid out by either government. Thus, this criterion cannot be met right now, but could be if the goals are clear, well-defined, and long-term in scope. We will propose strategies and goals later on. As for security and financial interests, both countries have vested interests in the stability of Libya. Both Canada and the United States have many oil and gas companies in Libya, with Canada having more than 40, according to the most recent Government of Canada reports. The US-Libya Business Association also reports that companies such as Motorola, ConocoPhillips, Garda-World, Pepsi, and others have business interests in Libya. Given the present reputation of the US and Canadian governments in the Maghreb since the Arab Spring, having an ally in the region and solidifying relations also would not hurt. Regarding casualties, current civilian casualties are estimated at 9,000 as a result of the fighting, which largely exceeds the level outlined above. Any conflict above 1,000 combat deaths per year is to be regarded as a war. This is in the ballpark of the Yemeni Civil War and the Gaza-Israel conflict, both widely considered global humanitarian crises. Finally, there is evidence to suggest support from local actors, from international law, and at least 2 allies. There have been calls from the GNA to intervene, as well as from Libya's national oil company, who want commercial and oil and gas field areas to be protected as well as civilian areas. The House of Representatives has also called for other states, including Egypt, to intervene to counter Turkish interference in the conflict. In 2016, local governments, including the Misrata Military Council, as well as national governmental bodies, were negotiating the specifics of an intervention led by the United States, France, and Italy, although that never lasted beyond anti-ISIL special operation missions. Many motions, including one in July this year and more last year, were also passed in Libyan parliament to authorize foreign intervention in the war to bring a peaceful and diplomatic end to it. The international legal community, including the United Nations Security Council, as divulged in press release 14243 in July, has also sought a peaceful end to the war. In the statement, Secretary General Guterres states that, quote, all opportunities to unblock the political stalemate must be seized, and that, quote, de-escalation, demobilization, reintegration, and disarmament efforts must be undertaken. This may even include, quote, the creation of a possible demilitarized zone in order to reach a negotiated settlement and save lives. Finally, in terms of allies, the United States and Canada would be supporting each other and would get support from either Turkey, the UAE, and possibly Italy, France, and the United Kingdom if they decided to get involved once more. Under this plan, the intervention would thus satisfy the 5 criteria. The approach, based on the one laid out by chief economist at the World Bank and Brookings Institution fellow Elena Ianchovicina, would be, quote, humanitarian and neutral, end quote, in order to increase the likelihood of its success. As she states in her report called Unintended Consequences, Foreign Intervention, Polarization, and Conflict in the Middle East and Northern Africa, interventions that were neither neutral nor humanitarian and favored different rebel or state factions, quote, created conditions for the competitive arming of rebels and financial support for rebel groups, increasing the risk of conflict intensification. She adds that such interventions, quote, intensify religious polarizations through their effect on intersectarian alienation, increasing the risk of high-intensity conflict in the Middle East and Northern Africa, end quote. With this in mind, we will present a policy where intervention is as neutral and humanitarian as human nature and global politics allow it to be. Under this neutral and humanitarian approach to intervention, the policy will be exclusively to protect civilians. Thus, no regime change policy will be pursued. In terms of the warring factions, intervening forces will not fire unless fired upon, and will only engage to defend civilians or themselves. The UN's advice will be followed in establishing demilitarized and safe zones, which should be established in central cities of Libya, including in Tripoli, Tobruk, Benghazi, and Misrata, similarly to what was done in Yugoslavia. These demilitarized zones will be protected by foreign forces from the country's respective militaries, in compliance with UN and NATO guidelines, in order to keep the peace in such highly populated civilian centers. On the latter point, the logistics and execution of the second intervention would be highly different from previous interventions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, Libya, and elsewhere, as no bombing campaigns, special forces operations, boots on the ground, or even privatization of military forces would be employed. This is due to the fact that the commanding approach will not be offensive, but rather defensive in nature, and as privatization of troops would obfuscate the legality, ethics, and efficacy of the mission there. In the demilitarized and safe zones, government and NGO-administered humanitarian aid will be delivered to civilians, as well as shelter and protection. No sides will be taken in the war. Although violence against civilians, war crimes, violations of international law, use of illegal weapons, disinformation campaigns, and genocidal language will be unequivocally denounced. Following this proactive tactic, the Allied and neutral governments shall also extend an invitation to all warring government factions to participate in peace settlement negotiation. This will be done every month by sending special envoys approved by the United Nations Secretariat General to the designated headquarters of each government faction, until such factions accept the invitation to negotiate with allies and foes. This will allow for a much higher chance of peace and negotiation, and one, as stated by UN Secretary General Guterres, that would be led by and for Libyans, rather than by foreign actors. On that point, the explicitly stated long-term objective will be, as alluded to in a recent report by the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, to have a settlement between warring factions brokered by the United Nations and supported by non-aligned states. This appears to be the only viable means for de-escalation that would enable Libya to regain its full sovereignty. The United States and Canada should get involved in Libya to protect civilians in civilian areas until warring factions are willing and able to negotiate and reach a settlement, one which would bring long-lasting peace, freedom, stability, democracy, and security to the Libyan people. As outlined in this policy proposal, that is entirely possible with the help of our two nations. In today's episode, we tackled the Second Civil War in Libya and proposed a way for Canada and the United States to help mitigate the damage dealt to civilian populations within that war and to help organize a peaceful and diplomatic end to it. This was accomplished through 4 rather than 3 equally long segments. In the first, we provided context to the war going back to the First Civil War and Revolution. Then we responded to counterarguments to foreign intervention in general and to foreign intervention in Libya in particular. After, a case for intervention in Libya was put forth, based on specific and rigid given criteria. Finally, the details of our policy prescriptions were outlined, describing in exact and precise terms how the intervention may be carried out and what results and consequences this would spark. This episode may act as a policy brief to guide Canadian and United States foreign policy regarding foreign intervention strategies and criteria. Thank you for joining us in today's rendition of Realpolitik. Please join us on the 1st of October for a new episode where we will explore how and why the intelligence communities of Canada and the United States should turn their domestic focus towards the growing threat of right-wing terrorism. Feel free to debate the ideas put forward in these episodes by submitting a comment, counter video, or by emailing us at realpolitikpodcast1@gmail.com. Please check out our Patreon if you would like to support us as well. All used sources for this episode will be in the description box below.